Hey everybody, Nick Espinosa, your chief security fanatic here. Don't forget to subscribe. And today we're going to be talking about coping in an era of constant surveillance. We all know we're being surveilled. It's absolutely crazy. Now, Simon Makin of SIAM had an interesting article on some of the research that is coming out on this that really got me thinking about what do we do with it and how do we cope? And so with that, let's start with the primer, because many of us, I think, will recognize the feeling of relentless surveillance, that we're just constantly being observed. And by virtue of that, we actually behave accordingly. Information about who we are, what we do, what we buy, where we go is increasingly available to completely anonymous third parties as well. That is in the back of our minds, and we're expected to present much of our lives to online audiences, and in some social circles, even share our locations continuously with friends. You've got that friend on Facebook that checks in when they have dinner, lunch, whatever, going to a movie, whatever they're doing, hospital. These are the kinds of things that essentially are pervasive throughout society. Millions of effectively invisibly closed circuit television systems all over the place, all these cameras everywhere, smart doorbells like Ring, they're watching us in public, and we know that facial recognition with AI is putting names to faces, all this kind of stuff. And so the real question then becomes, how does being watched affect us? And first things first, this isn't new. Interestingly enough, in 1898, a psychologist named Norman Triplett showed that cyclists, meaning those that were racing bikes, raced harder in the presence of others. In other words, if they were alone and racing on their own, they tended to coast more. If they were in a pack, they were pushing each other. And basically, from the 1970s and onwards, studies have shown that we basically change our overt behavior when we are being watched in order to manage our reputation and obviously the social consequences that could go if we go off book, or that could happen if we go off book. But being watched doesn't just change our behavior. Decades of research shows it also infiltrates our mind and therefore impacts how we think. And now a new study reveals how being watched affects unconscious processing in our brain. So in this era of surveillance, the research findings are raising concerns about our collective mental health. So think about it this way. Being looked at just in public grabs our attention. Now, this is demonstrated by the stare in a crowd effect. In other words, amid a sea of faces all around us that aren't looking at us, we immediately detect the single one that is. We've all been in a crowded room, whatever it is, and we've all locked eyes with somebody. That's what we're talking about. We're looking at them and they find us. They're looking at us, we find them. And this is because gaze direction, especially eye contact, is a powerful social signal that helps us to perceive others' intentions and therefore predict their behavior. Even babies basically have this. A direct gaze quickly draws their attention as well. As they gaze at us, it draws our attention. This is in our DNA. Like, this ability likely evolved to detect predators, which may explain why being watched can provoke psychological discomfort and physical fight or flight responses like sweating, et cetera, et cetera. You're just raising that alert level in your body. And on a conscious level, we behave differently when we are watched. We become more pro-social, meaning we are likely to give and less likely to cheat or litter. In other words, if you're left to your own devices, you're taking 2 cookies, but if somebody's around, you're taking 1, right? You're not going to throw that trash out because there's social pressure if you're being watched. If you throw the trash on the ground, that somebody is basically going to potentially call you out. You're policing yourself as a result of this surveillance. Some studies have even suggested that theft or littering could be reduced merely by posting pictures of eyes. In other words, you see the eyes, hanging on a wall or something like that, you're less inclined because you're more subconsciously inclined to behave yourself. This kind of thinking led to the idea that surveillance could be used for social good, basically to prevent crime. The fact, though, that people behave differently under watchful eyes isn't surprising. I mean, who among us hasn't acted more selfishly when we're alone or less when somebody could see us, right? Psychologists basically put this down to concern with our reputation, as I mentioned before. But Over the past decades, researchers have also found that being watched affects cognitive functions such as memory and attention. So, interestingly enough, it can be very distracting. One study found that participants performed worse on a working memory task when they were basically presented with pictures of people looking at them compared to when they were shown pictures of people with averted eyes. In other words, I'm looking at you in my camera right now, but if I'm looking away from you, it's ultimately less settling if you think I'm surveilling you. The researchers concluded that a direct gaze grabs participants' attention and then diverts their attentional resources from that given task. In other words, you're focusing on something, but you're subconsciously kind of realizing, oh, I'm being watched by a pair of eyes. Other studies have found that more functions ranging from our spatial cognition to language processing abilities have been similarly taxed by a watchful stare. The effects of surveillance on cognition go even deeper into our brain's unconscious processing of the world around us. In a study published last December, researchers showed that being watched accelerated participants' unconscious analysis of faces. So, for example, a study found that participants became aware of faces looking at them faster than faces with averted eyes, showing that our brain processes essentially gaze direction before we even know that we're basically seeing anything. In other words, subconsciously, we are seeing the person gazing at us and we are moving towards that direction before we have time to actually register that's what's happening. Surveillance, therefore, seems to shift the social processing into high gear. We're basically continuously in fight or flight mode due to all the surveillance, the Ring doorbells, closed circuit TVs, everything around us, which is taxing us mentally. So then the next question then obviously becomes is, how might today's omnipresent electronic eyes affect our mental health? And it's interesting because the research is showing that people with conditions such as social anxiety have a hypersensitivity to social cues that results in feelings of distress. This constant surveillance could also tax cognition in ways that we don't yet understand. And this body of research also suggests that bringing more surveillance into the workplace, that's usually an attempt to try and boost productivity, could actually have the opposite effect because people are obviously distracted as they know the cameras are on them. So, it also suggests that online testing environments where students are being watched through webcams, like by human proctors or artificial intelligence, could also lead to lower performance as well. So that really has me thinking, how do we cope with this? Because quite frankly, we can't really unplug, right? We have studies that show if you turn off the phone, your mobile phone, you get off social media, you're not really doing anything that has those watchful eyes or that requires you to interact, you feel better. But it's all around us, no matter what we're doing, whether we're staying at home, traveling, going into the supermarket, all of these kinds of things. And think about it this way. If you were basically, let's say, born in the early 80s or earlier than that, you grew up in an era that really didn't have this. You became socially adjusted, not having yourself constantly being monitored, constantly being a camera in your face, because every camera, or rather every phone, has a forward-facing camera now. You didn't have that. And by virtue of that, you became more well-adjusted. And we've seen in younger generations higher amounts of anxiety, depression, all these kinds of things. And I think what we have here is a correlation between those two. Now, obviously, correlation is not causation, but we now have longitudinal studies that said the same thing about social media and depression, and those ended up being true. I think this is in that vein, because if we are constantly in fight or flight mode, it's taxing on who we are. And so how do we cope with this? Honestly, I think it's unplugging. Honestly, I think it's reversing the advancement towards a surveillance state around the world. This is not a country thing. China's got a surveillance state. London, for example, in the UK has very heavily surveillance. You go to a major modern city in the United States or any other major modern city, you've got a lot of surveillance around there, private and public. And quite frankly, I think that's doing us a detriment. And so I think two things are going to happen here. Or rather, one of two things. One, we're going to continue to deteriorate in this sense to the point where we're going to backlash against this, which may not necessarily be a bad thing in that sense that, hey, we've got an anti-movement here. Or what's going to happen is over generations, we're simply going to adapt to this, which may potentially mean that we're going to stop caring if we're being surveilled, which means we're going to become more selfish. We're going to become bigger jerks, even with the cameras all around us. And we've seen a rash of that. You can go on to YouTube or any one of these, and you can see people fighting each other or road rage incidents, even though we know we're being surveilled in many different ways. And it's usually just people with cell phones in another car watching you pummel some dude on the side of a road. This is what's happening. And so I think it's a problem. I think it's actually contributing to this. And while I think social media is the biggest driver, we can't discount the constant surveillance that we're in. And I'm not a big fan of the surveillance state, of the facial recognition, and everything else. So I think it's a problem, and I think the coping mechanism is to completely unplug every camera everywhere. But quite frankly, that's not going to happen as I sit in front of a camera talking to you. And if you're listening to this, I'm still sitting in front of a camera nevertheless. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please attempt to stay private and secure. Take care.